Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much for joining us in a sunny but cold day. And those who are from outside, my name is Ani Dasgupta. I head the cities team at the WRI, and we are very, very, very excited today of launching our latest paper on our World Resources report series called Towards More Equal City on a very vexing problem, right? All of us know 2.5 billion more people will live in cities, so cities will grow. The question this paper asks, can they grow more sustainably? Are there ways to grow that is more reasonable, more sustainable to the earth, to the people? That's a question every city is facing from everywhere. It's not just global south cities are growing. In places like Japan, where overall population is going down, actually the bigger cities are growing. So this is a very important question of how this is what the paper addresses. So just wanted to make sure you're in the right room. If you came for something else, it might be a different part of WRI that's going on. So warm welcome. The way the World Resources Report on Cities called Towards More Equal Cities basically is a state of knowledge report on cities, focus on Global South. It asks the question, what will the future be? What kind of cities we will have? What kind of people will live in it? And more importantly, the three goals that most cities try to meet of growth, creating jobs for all these people that live there, but also managing the environmental footprint to be sustainable environmentally and to make sure all the people living in cities have higher quality of life. The work we are doing for the last 2 years asks the question, how can cities achieve this? And focuses on the question of equity, of how we, as you can see from the title, our focus is if cities were more equal, can these economic outcomes and environmental outcomes can be, the argument we are making, cannot be met if they're not equal. So that's what the whole series is about. We have 16 papers in the series. 8 of them are technical papers on sectors like water, sanitation, transport, this one on urban expansion on land, and 8 others, complementary paper on deep case studies of 8 cities across the world where change has taken place. So it records how cities change. The argument being to get to a more towards a more equal city, we need transformative change in cities. And can we learn about transformative change better? Do we know how change takes place? So our hope is these 2 strands of work will come together and create a body of knowledge for cities about what to do, how to make cities better, more equal, more sustainable, more economically robust. That's the body of work. This particular paper that we're talking about is actually, I think, one of the strongest paper in this series. Asks a very, very important question that every city is facing. Anjali and Karen, you'll soon hear from. You'll hear a lot more about this paper in a minute. Have been working for. I think we started talking about this in Quito. When we met Karen, I think Anjali too, for the first time in Quito, talking about it. So it's been a really labor of love for Anjali. I don't know how many nights she's been awake working on this, but I can, by looking at this, Anjali, it's been worthwhile. It's a fantastic piece of work. You will hear about them. So the way we'll structure this afternoon is you'll hear from Karen and Anjali a short description of the paper where we are. Then we'll have a panel discussion. We have 2 fantastic panelists who've been working on cities and urban issues. Victor Vergara from the World Bank, someone I know for many years. We went to school together. And Nora from IDB, who actually been collaborating with us for a while, has done phenomenal work on this issue in Mexico and other places. So thank you very much for making it here. Our Managing Director, Manish, will moderate the session. Manish, thank you for being here, being part of it. Manish has been a big champion of the WRR work throughout the last 2 years. So that's what we'll do. Then we will wrap up this with a very, very interesting piece of work WRI doing, building on this, how to make the data that this team has collected public. So you'll get a little demo from our Resource Watch team about how that works. And then after you've labored through all this, we will have a reception and we can have some drinks together. So that's the plan. And over to you, Anjali.
This is on, right? Yeah. All right. Thank you, Ani. And I do want to, welcome everybody. I'm very excited that we're launching this paper. I should say I'm also equally a bit disappointed that we couldn't have Karen here in person with us because of flight snafus and all that goes on with bad weather. She couldn't make it, but I'm very glad that she can join us on video. Karen is professor of geography and urbanization science at Yale University at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. She's been an incredible partner on this work for the last 2 years, more than 2 years maybe. And I think this paper has been a collaboration that has kind of brought the best out, the best strengths of both of our institutes. We've been able to kind of bring to it and bring the data and the policy capability. So thank you, Karen, for joining. So going forward, let me just, Ani's laid some of the context around the WRR already. So I won't dwell too much on that, except to give you maybe a few highlights on background and where this paper fits into this suite of 16 papers that Ani was talking about. So this is where we began the journey in 2015. 2015, we began the research. Some of you were here at our first stakeholder event when we were kind of grappling with what should be our entry point, what should be our framing in this whole space of sustainable cities. It's a crowded space. What is it that we think is the biggest challenge we want to write about? And then we launched our framing paper at the Habitat 3 conference in Quito, where after doing analysis of many trends around population growth, not only current population growth projections for the next 15 years, city level economic indicators, we were able to get some hard to access data at the time. And we came up with these analyses that show you where population growth is expected to occur for the next 15 years. And you can primarily see that it is in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, all those big green dots. So that kind of set the context for our work. Now we have the SDGs. That was a big development in 2015. The global community adopted the SDGs. We all kind of agree on goals for sustainable development. We have targets now, but how different cities are going to actually reach those targets and achieve those goals is going to be very, very different. And I guess we came to this with a realization that you hear this a lot. One size fits all approaches don't work. But how do you start to think of the variety of actions that cities can take, the variety of contexts that they have? And we came up with this categorization of cities globally. We looked at where they are in terms of their current income level and the extent to which their urban population growth over the next 15 years will keep pace with their projected economic growth. We had these projections from Oxford Economics, Cities Database, and essentially came up with 4 categories: struggling cities, emerging cities, thriving, and stabilizing cities. And the struggling and emerging cities, the green and yellow dots on this map, pretty much are the cities that are going to face the largest challenge. If you go back to that map and compare, it's a similar sort of corresponding, South Asian, Sub-Saharan African, Southeast Asian cities are going to face that challenge of population growth and are not going to have the economic capacity to meet it. This is the framing Ani talked about. We all have seen and heard this conceptualization of sustainable development as trying to balance trade-offs across the economy, environment, equity issues. There's tensions and cities need to balance all of that. This has been the narrative for a couple of decades. And since Quito, we've tried to turn that triangle on its side, if you will, and we're saying that given the trends we are seeing in cities, where population growth is going to occur, trends like urbanization of poverty, which means poor people are getting concentrated in these cities. There's increased migration, there's other forces driving that increase. Equitable access to core services, the services through which a citizen experiences the city, if you will. Think of just affordable housing and land, transportation, water and sanitation, electricity usage, jobs. These are the ways in which a citizen experiences the city. And our argument was that by prioritizing equitable access to these services, you can achieve a more economically productive, and a more environmentally secure city overall. This is, Ani talked about this too. And so it's equity as an entry point to transforming cities. Won't go with this in too much detail, but this is broadly the architecture of this whole WRR effort, the 16 papers. Ani talked about this, 8 thematic papers. You're now going to be looking at the one on urban expansion. And we've been doing the city case studies. We picked 8 cities in the global south that demonstrate this framing, if you will, that they've been able to make interventions in one or more sectors of services, core services, and seen that transformation occur cross-sectorally. It's not a linear process of change, but we've been able to document all the policies and actions, decisions that led to that in a few cities. Enabling conditions that we talk about across all of these papers as common in terms of governance and finance and so on. I'll speak a little bit about that. Just a snapshot of the published papers. Citiesforall.org is the website. So with that, I will move into this paper, why we wrote it. Please, I'm going to go through it just in a superficial way. So pick up a copy, take a look. There's a lot of data and detail in here. But this is essentially the challenge, right? This is a 2012 analysis, and actually it's been done by Karen Seto and her team, but also others like New York University, Marin Institute have published similar statistics where compared to a 2000 baseline, if you look at globally what the urban land area is, it's going to triple in size by 2030. And so if you just sort of do a very simplistic business as usual trend projection from today out to 2030, we expect the global urban land area to increase by 80%. And that's the this is a remarkable picture, I think, from Mumbai. If you get a chance, check out this website, unequalscenes.com. It shows you spatial inequality through these aerial photos of cities. It really highlights what we're talking about in terms of access to services and inequities. So going to trends. Rapid urban growth, a lot of us over the last few years, have seen images like this. As satellite imagery has gotten more and more sophisticated, in Quito, there was the Atlas of Urban Expansion that was launched by NYU, and these are just some images of one city, Shanghai. That's Shanghai and its urban built-up area in purple, growing over 15 years. This is Dhaka. You can go on that database and find 200 cities for which this kind of growth has been documented, primarily through satellite imagery. Briefly to touch upon why we are interested in this, why the environmental community, the development community, if you sit and in the sort of climate change discipline, why you're interested in this. Unmanaged expansion, which is the kind of urban expansion we're seeing, and I'll describe a little bit what we mean by unmanaged, imposes heavy environmental burdens. You're seeing some of the fastest growing urban areas in biodiversity hotspots. You'll see from our team a demonstration of Cochin and other cities, Southeast Asian cities, where you're seeing biodiversity hotspots getting sort of eaten into. Floodplains. You hear stories almost every monsoon season now. What used to be seasonal rainfall in South Asia now causes catastrophic flooding. So again, there's enough evidence and trends to show why that's occurring. It's overconstruction, overdevelopment, occurring in an unregulated way in environmental hotspots, vulnerable zones. So you're seeing flooding, you're seeing cities growing into areas of water stress, you're seeing them growing into prime agricultural land, again, starts to challenge, food security issues and so on. And then there are economic consequences that I was starting to allude to with that image of Mumbai. Deepening social inequity, where data shows us that depending on what do we mean by spatial inequity? I should actually talk about this. Depending on where you're located in the city, you face higher costs of access to services and jobs. So the data shows us that if you live in peripheral areas that are not well serviced by municipal services, you can have up to 30 times higher costs as a household of accessing water, sanitation, electricity, because you're relying on informal provision, you're relying on self-provision. It's mainly affluent households that have the coping mechanisms to do that. Transportation, 2 to 3 times higher costs of commuting and in terms of time and money if you live in the periphery of the city. That was a little bit about how it affects people and households. Why should cities care? It becomes a huge governance challenge. This to me is actually on the left side, an interesting map that we should be developing and could very easily for many cities around the world. What it shows you is Bangalore, and we worked with our India team to do this. It plots the different jurisdictions of the service providing agencies on the left side. So you see the Water and Sanitation Agency, the Land Planning Agency, Transportation, Electricity Provision Agency. The right side shows you where the growth is occurring in the city. It's a dark red ring. It's all on the periphery, and those are precisely the regions where, if you look at that map on the left, those are where the jurisdictions of these agencies don't match up. So you start to see the gap and the shortfall in services in those exact areas. For many reasons, this is a problem. Those jurisdictions are under rural agencies, sometimes under state level agencies. They're not in the city domain. So that's kind of the key point. The spatial mismatch between jurisdictions creates these gaps in access to services. So that's, with that still background, I think I want to move into what we did that was kind of new and in our minds not done before, just from the literature that we looked at. We combined, now think of that Shanghai map that I showed you, think of the Dhaka map I showed you. We've seen a lot of those images of outward expansion. There has not been much that captures how cities have grown vertically upwards. Researchers have been trying to use satellite imagery to look at shadows and so on. There's efforts in play right now. But we were able to, with Karen's help, combine optical data, that's your standard satellite imagery data, with what we call radar data, microwave data that kind of bounces off of built volumes. And in doing so, over a decade, we were able to plot how cities have grown vertically and horizontally for about 500 cities. It allowed us to actually do two things. One, it allows you to see at least the two-dimensional nature of growth, the horizontal and the vertical. The second thing is it allows you to analyze and characterize the growth within the city. We tend to see blanket policy recommendations. Cities need to densify. Cities need to do this. Just the fact that within the same city, you have many different types of growth occurring was an important finding for us. So let's talk a little bit about that. And also just looking at the variation within cities was one part. We were able to then aggregate that to kind of come up with city level indicators of outward growth and upward growth. And that's what you see here in this map. Just shows you this index that we came up with, an upward growth index, and how those 500 cities, roughly 500 cities around the world look. Very interesting to see that East Asian vertical expansion primarily concentrated in China. Outward growth, you see happening in a more widespread way globally. But what's interesting is, again, if you compare both maps, those cities that I talked about, the struggling and the emerging, the South Asian, look at South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, there's outward growth happening with very, very little upward growth. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Upward growth in our data and the literature that we looked at comes about in mature urban areas, comes about in already valuable urban areas. It requires more investment. It requires more regulation. It requires more planning. And those are some of the drivers why we see this kind of outward growth being concentrated in these cities, these low-income cities. I won't go into too much detail on this because this is just represented well in the paper, but this gives you a sense of the types. I talked about the different types of growth within cities. This gives you a sense of how we characterized it. And maybe the two, we created these 5 clusters. The 2 to focus on is maybe cluster 2 and 5, just shows you the 2 contrasting types of growth. Cluster 2 is very much new outward growth. Cluster 5 is where cities are growing mostly upward. This map that I thought is, again, very interesting, this chart, shows you the same phenomenon through arrows. Think of the pink, flatter arrows as being much more horizontal growth over time, the blue vertical arrows as being much more vertical growth over this decade that we're talking about. And again, look at some of those cities. Lagos, 22 million people today. Kinshasa, I believe, is 10 million, 9 point something. And that's been the trend of outward growth, primarily, very little upward growth over the last decade. Look at Beijing, so look at Dhaka. I showed that picture to you earlier, but again, primarily outward growth. So we start to see these, interesting trends. And here is kind of a summary, if you will. We try to lay out some continental, regional trends. Cities across Africa expanding primarily outward, Asia mostly upward, but with great variation, skewed very much by those Chinese cities growing upward. South Asian, West Asian cities still very much growing outward. South America is actually having the least urban growth now in terms of upward or outward. We've seen in our categorization, struggling and emerging cities being dominated by the outward expansion, the vertical growth being concentrated much more in the thriving cities. Just interesting, we're not even going towards causation here, but just the correlation of how the higher income cities are seeing much more of the vertical growth. It's actually intuitive. One of the points I definitely want to highlight is that despite all the sophisticated remote sensing analysis I'm talking about, this problem, this challenge of how growth is occurring in the developing world with high levels of informality, self-built informal settlements still remains. We have over 800 million people living in these sorts of settlements. And you look at the most sophisticated satellite imagery data, it is still challenging to researchers. And how do you characterize these informal settlements? Materials differ. They're not captured, certainly through the radar data that I talked about. So this is still an area of work that we need good standards for in terms of analysis. We need good ground truthing and ground surveys to follow up the remote sensing methods. And there are some initial efforts going on in this area. So now getting to those cities, the struggling and emerging cities and their primarily outward expansion. What are some drivers? We started looking into that. I'll briefly touch on this. There's some drivers, just economic growth, in migration from rural areas, natural population increase. These are not in the control of cities. This was interesting work from one of Karen's papers that shows you how urban land area expansion, to what extent it depends on economic factors and to what extent it depends on population growth. And we see some of the wealthier cities of Europe, North America, and China, where economic growth is primarily causing that urban land expansion. Again, you look at India and Africa, there's a consistent story emerging here. And we tried to piece together the evidence for this. India and Africa, much more of the land expansion is occurring due to population growth. So with sort of looking at those drivers, we came upon, okay, we now have understood the patterns of growth. We've understood what the driving forces are. What are the challenges we want to focus on? And what is the problem we're trying to solve? So I'll talk about 3 challenges. And this is one. And then we'll sort of move into what are the policy recommendations we come up with in the paper. Challenge 1, distorted land markets. You actually hear a lot about this anecdotally and in news articles. There's not so much evidence and literature you'll see on this. But the fact that there's a lot of the speculative development that occurs in global South cities, land development led by private real estate developers often, in the absence of effective or enforced regulation or planning regimes, you see development occurring in a way that is completely driven by maximizing economic returns. You see a lot of high-end development occurring, and it can be where land is cheapest, so the peripheral areas of cities. The land-based returns primarily accrue to public sector stakeholders. There are no, and I'm generalizing a little bit, but this is the pattern we see. There are not effective mechanisms for public agencies to draw that increase in land value that results from development and use it for public purposes. You see a lot of vacant land within cities. We had some very interesting, eye-opening data points in the paper on this about how in Nairobi, 40% of zoned residential land lies vacant. And this again goes back to the low capacity financial resources of these cities. They just don't have the financial resources to build on this land in many cases. Some of these other African cities, Harare and Maputo, 30% of land within 5 kilometers of where jobs might be concentrated remains underdeveloped. Some more details in the paper, but I'll just flag here a partnership with NYU and the Marin Institute, where again, they collected the first of its kind data on land use regulations in 200 cities, the same cities for which they produced the urban expansion maps. And this was amazing to, I think, for us to see, to plot it against our 4 categories, because here again, you start to see the struggling cities have the weakest land records. Struggling and emerging. It's almost a neat progression because it signals institutional capacity at some level. You look at the extent to which these cities have land use plans in place, the extent to which those land use plans are enforced or respected by private developers or even respected by public agencies themselves. And you see all of those sort of challenges arising most in the struggling and emerging cities. The second challenge that we cover is this phenomenon where new growth is occurring in areas that are not connected to employment and to services. And a lot of this comes around, Nora's work has captured this really, really well. A lot of this comes about because, and we talk about many reasons in the paper, but one reason is, think of national level housing policies, where Government of India today has a low affordable housing for all program and an amazing, some ambitious target of 22 million homes or something to be built over the next 5 years. With targets like this, and we've seen that in Brazil, we've seen that in Mexico, with targets like this, but no location-oriented mandates around it, or no incentives to direct location in particular parts of the city, what will developers do? Land developers go out and find land in the cheapest areas of the city. There are no mandates for that land to be well serviced, well connected, and that's where the housing has come up. And we've seen this problem in Mexico City, where a lot of peripheral housing lies vacant today because it just doesn't have basic services like water. So this is a challenge, and a lot of it also relates to just coordination between land management agencies, land planning agencies, and the infrastructure provision agencies. I talked about the location and sensitive housing policies too. This is challenge 3, where it's this form of development and growth that we're seeing in these cities, which is largely informal. It's informal and it's outside of the purview of formal plans and policies because it's happening in a way where it's absorbing traditional villages, traditional settlements on the periphery of the city. It's happening in a way that it's sort of capturing agricultural land. There's also, this map is actually this picture is interesting. I took this picture in Mumbai. It shows you a huge plot of government-owned vacant land at the back in Mumbai and abutting against it informal settlements. This is one of the peripheral areas of Mumbai. Start to see all those challenges in relief here. So how should we think about strategies for these growing low-income cities? And I guess what the analysis has pointed us to, just looking at this growth in 2 dimensions, considering informality, considering the weak institutional context, considering the low financial resources, we need to be nuanced in the way that we come up with these recommendations. We definitely want to use underutilized land within cities. We want to use it efficiently. We want to direct development in locations that are well connected and well serviced. But we also want to increase the supply of this land, affordable, well-serviced land. One of the reasons for that speculative development that happens is because there are shortages of this kind of this affordable, well-connected, well-serviced land. So you need to accommodate future growth, knowing that populations are going to swell. Our action areas that correspond to those 3 challenges I talked about. The first one, using sensible land use regulations. Land use regulations exist in many cities. They tend to have sometimes perverse outcomes where they almost push development to the periphery of the city. But land use regulations and private developer incentives that direct development into particular parts within the city. There are examples we talk about in the paper. So for example, Mexican cities have urban containment perimeters, they call them. South African cities have urban development zones. Brazilian cities like Sao Paulo have something called urban operations, where the city government decides that this is a part of the city where we want affordable new development to occur, and we're going to create incentives for private developers to build in those areas. We're going to create enabling policies for them to do so. There's also this idea that we see in Latin American cities and Chinese cities, where cities are able to impose limits on how long private developers can hold on to land. This is important because it actually, again, helps bring that land into the market, and it helps reduce speculation. So typically what you would see in a city of South Asia or even Africa is that developers would buy land at a very cheap cost from farmers, strike these informal deals, and hold on to it for 2 decades, 3 decades sometimes. And the moment a major infrastructure project like an airport or a ring road or something gets announced, you start to see a lot of high-end, a little bit of caricaturing here, but you start to see gated communities coming up, shopping malls coming up. It's often development that is, again, aimed at maximizing economic returns. So a way to do that is to kind of limit how long they can hold on to land, but also impose taxes on vacant land. Many cities have done this. The second challenge about deficient services in these growing areas, cities need to make sure that they increase the supply of land in a way that they can partner with service providing agencies. Medellin is a great example in Colombia, where the land development agency partners with the utilities to decide which are those areas of the city where it's viable to extend infrastructure and services to, and development occurs in those areas. Bangkok has a subdivision law where developers cannot build in a part of the city that is not well serviced. So there are, and forming these partnerships with private developers or utilities is very important because cities do not have the resources to develop the land, provide the services, do all of that themselves. There are mechanisms to do this. Land readjustment mechanisms have been, there's a way to get it right and there's a way to get it wrong. Many cities in Colombia and some cities in India, cities like Seoul in South Korea have been able to manage their urban growth in a more sustainable way using these mechanisms. And partnerships, like I said, exist in many Latin American cities, some Indian cities as well. I won't go over this in too much detail, but just to say that there's a lot of fragmented land ownership in some of these cities we're talking about, which is why this partnership approach is essential. The third action area around informal settlements and what do cities do? We've been talking a lot about future development. And I think the important point we want to make here is when you have Mumbai or Lagos with more than a third or close to a half of their population living in slums, that is a real problem you need to deal with. You cannot ignore that problem. You need to improve quality of life in those settlements. You need to integrate those settlements into the growth plans of the city. You need to integrate them into the service network, the employment network of the city. So we talk about ways to do this in the paper. Many cities have been able to extend core services to these settlements, but also in place through upgrading efforts, been able to replot and work with communities, to work with the informal agents that transact in these communities to create affordable plots of land that are serviced that households can build on incrementally. So that's what we mean by affordable density. Several examples that we talk about in the paper. And then I just will highlight that across all of these, the way the writing of the paper is organized and the way we think about this, there are certain enabling conditions that support all of these strategies. If you just look, I'll touch upon a few, under governance, transparent land records, transparent records of land transactions. This is really important just to be able to do the land readjustment schemes and redistribution that I was talking about, just to be able to capture, just to be able to do basic property taxation and implement land value capture schemes. So that's an important one. Incentives for agencies to coordinate. Sometimes you have national level funding programs that can create incentives for city agencies to coordinate and work with each other to plan new development. We talk about being able to pilot new regulations and be flexible with regulations so that you're able to adapt and change regulations as cities grow, as economic changes occur. I'll touch upon one last one because I think this is interesting. This is a new possibility that is afforded to us now by the use of technology, where cities are being able to better assess the conditions of informal settlements, figure out where these settlements are occurring. None of this gets captured in censuses, so they're able to use satellite imagery and drone surveys to do that. just some city level examples of how those enabling conditions have been put in place. We're going to run out of time, so I will just go on to the last slide. This is, in conclusion, just to say that some urban expansion is going to be inevitable in these growing areas. And urban land area will continue to increase. How we can manage that expansion in a way that is equitable, that is preventing environmental risk, that is increasing economic productivity, is what we set out to do in this work. Using new data, we showed how cities are growing vertically and horizontally, and there's variation within cities and across cities, and strategies to manage this growth should accordingly vary. And finally, the last one, of recognizing that where some of this growth is going to occur are the kinds of cities that face constraints to upward growth. We cannot just go in there and talk to city decision makers and say, build taller buildings, increase density. These are already very dense contexts. We need to break that puzzle down. We need to look at the constraints they face to upward growth, which is a lot of these regulatory and governance issues, and the growing informality that they have. And strategies should address that context in particular. With that, I will stop, and thank you so much for your time. I'll hand it over to Manish now and invite the panelists to come on board.
Great. Thank you very much. Really a distinct pleasure to be here with all of you today to continue this conversation on this paper. We have a tremendous set of panelists, and quite importantly, one of the co-authors here. We're going to talk a little bit about this paper. So I thought I would ask each of them 3-4 questions. We'll have a little bit of a conversation amongst ourselves, but I want to save enough time to have a really active conversation with all of you. So we will come to that in just a moment. But just to properly introduce our co-author, Karen Seto, who is the Frederick Hickson Professor of Geography and Urbanization Science at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale University, a co-author of this paper, and I'm going to come to her in just a moment. And we have next to Anjali, we have Victor Vergara, lead urban specialist at the World Bank, and Nora de Duren, who's an urban development and housing expert at the Inter-American Development Bank. And they all have an incredibly distinguished track record of expertise on this issue. If you have any doubt, you probably know of them, but we have a very long biography of each of them in the handout materials. I thought I would start with a relatively, so I know you had some questions that we gave to you. I'm not going to ask those. I'm gonna, but I'm sure you'll find a way to weave in what you were planning to say. I thought I would start with just, Karen, I would start with you, but then turn to both Victor and Nora. Just say a few words, a little bit about your current work, and kind of how your current work may intersect with what we're talking about today, just so people can kind of situate this in the lending of the IDB, in the lending of the bank, in the research, Karen, that you're doing. But I'd also like, as you do that, then to, and this is the easy question, pick one thing in the paper or in Anjali's talk that particularly stood out for you. The one thing that you thought was new, something that really needs to be underscored. Share with the audience what that would be. And with Karen, since you were a co-author, I suspect there's many things you like about the paper, but would love to hear from you as well about the 1 or 2 things that you really think are refreshing and new, interesting about this paper. So Karen, if we could start with you, that would be great. We can see you here, so please, over to you.
Great. Well, first of all, Anjali, that was a great presentation, and I'm sorry not to be there. I think, so you had 2 questions. One is how this fits into the work of my lab, really, and I should say it's not really my work, it's the work of my entire lab, and how, well, what were the big new insights? So let me start with the first one, because that's really easy. We've never used, not to my knowledge, there hasn't been a study at this scale that looks at within city variation as well as outward growth. If you look at the remote sensing studies out there on urban expansion, 99% of them look at the growth of cities outward In my own lab, we've done a lot of this work where we've looked at how cities have expanded into agricultural areas and biodiversity habitats and on the coast, et cetera. But we've never seen a study that's looked at so many cities. Now, there have been a handful of studies that have looked at the internal dynamics, the upward expansion, the volumetric growth within cities, but that's been one or two cities at a time. And so when Anjali first approached me about this project, it was very exciting because of the magnitude of the study, and also to be able to cluster these cities and to see, are there variations, are there similarities? And I think one of the things that was really quite surprising was to see how concentrated the upward growth is. That it is really concentrated in East Asia, primarily in China, but primarily in East Asia. And that for most of what we're seeing as urban expansion, it is around outward growth and not upward growth. And so, when we talk about increasing density, I think there are huge institutional governance and finance challenges ahead. In terms of the first question that you asked about how this dovetails into the work that we're doing in my lab, I have a number of doctoral students who are working on very similar issues, trying to understand how access to electricity is equitable or not, and trying to use remote sensing to get a better understanding of within urban variation across cities around the world.
Great, thank you, Karen. So really important kind of new contribution around this upward growth. Victor, I'll turn to you now maybe and say either. Nora's happy to go either way.
Here, Nora, you go first. I wonder if you would use.
Sure, just a little bit about your work and how this intersects, but then also something about this paper that.
Yeah, just briefly about my work, but I think this will lead nicely to what we just have seen is we're completing a study on Favela Barrio. I don't know if you're familiar with that work, which was the improvement of informal settlements in Rio de Janeiro. It's a huge investment by the city, and the IDB contributed, but also many other organizations. And what we are doing now, about to publish, is what had happened since that was completed. The project was completed 10 years ago. More than 80 favelas were improved. And the question is, what had happened with the infrastructure that was built, and what had happened with the people who were living there? And the answer is not much, and that's a bad answer, because what we have seen is that the work was completed, but after 10 years, the situation of the infrastructure reverts to the original one, comparing favelas that were improved with those that were not improved. And the reason is that the level of violence inside the favelas is so high that there is both purposeful destruction of infrastructure to prevent police from coming there, but also there is a lack of access to maintenance crews to attend these places. And also sometimes relates to problems with sustainability in terms of floods and other issues. And in terms of the population, kind of like what you could expect is that the income of the population who are living in these favelas did not grow as much as we expected because of the lack of sustainability of the whole project. So that's a very humbling lesson for us all, because we were, as a community of urban planners, that was one of the things that we always push for, which is upgrade informal settlements. And now going back to the work that we just have seen, first of all, congratulations. It's an amazing effort, both in scale and in depth, and having the ability to show this with so many dimensions, like graphically and numerically. I think that's amazing. So well done. In terms of the things that struck me the most is these images that keeps on appearing, in which you see the vertical and the horizontal next to each other. It's not the idea of a very smooth transition, but you see cities where the vertical is the formal and the horizontal tends to be the informal. So that calls into question the whole idea of who is growing and how. And I think that, for example, in the case of Latin America, what we have seen is, yes, you're not going to perceive a lot of growth in these cities just because they have been 80%, these countries have been 80% urbanized for the last 20 years. So, there's a limit how much people can actually move, from rural areas to urban areas. Having said that, the only growth that we have seen in terms of population, significant growth has been happening in informal areas. So I think that there is a question, thinking about what you presented in who is growing how, and then which kind of measures you need to create a more even distribution of wealth. And then the other question was in terms of agency, because you were showing these things, but I was wondering who is behind these actions, and also the policies that you've shown, at which level they do need to happen. Some of them are at national level, some of them seem to be metropolitan, some of them might require bottom-up actions.
Great. Thank you, Vic.
Thank you. Well, I am currently working in the independent evaluation group of the World Bank. So the work that we are undertaking is looking back as the work that Nora has done and trying to understand what works and what doesn't work. And we are focusing very much on the same issues as being presented in this study. We just completed a major report on urban resilience, and we are now beginning a study, an evaluation of the bank's contribution to managing urban growth. We're at the very, very early stages. So this is very, very useful. I think listening to Nora, I think one of the reflections that in this context that we have had and the due diligence that we're undertaking to carry out this work was some of the work that Sumila Guyani did some years ago, looking at the same question you had, but in India. Mm-hmm. And there, I think it's a more happy story. It's a story of a transformative power of smart investments when this upgraded areas are able to come into and be part of the texture of the city. And I think that we are eager to find out the variety of resolutions that the bank has had in its interventions. I imagine some are similar to what you mentioned, the work that Janice Perlman did, mm-hmm. I guess, going back 40 years after her PhD, was also sobering because it wasn't also a happy story. Yeah. So we're looking for happy stories and we're looking for sad stories. Hopefully we'll find more happy stories about how we are working in cities and urban expansion. I think there are many things stand out in the excellent work that was presented, and I think it's a major contribution to the field, and I think it's going to be influential, and it should continue and the dialogue and spark other new conversations. I think that the issue of the verticality of cities is a very appealing one, but it's a dangerous one as well. It is, I think, I think we all have skyline envy. A city is what you see from far away, and it really isn't. But that's the image of the city that is perceived. And when we see the crazy growth of Sao Paulo without any hierarchy, this incredible, set of 40 and 50-story skyscrapers that just floods an area, or the craziness of the new skyscrapers. I was just in Guadalajara last week, and there are some crazy skyscrapers going up for in places that have no reason to have a skyscraper. Same in Addis Ababa, in Dar es Salaam as well. And these are cities that have have very limited infrastructure below the ground. And I wonder, it's clearly less appealing, but we need to start from the ground up. And I think one of the interesting reflections in the paper, which I think is perhaps the most important, is whether or not hopefully the lack of infrastructure below ground is a signal that things aren't ready to go up. Because I fear that cities are going up even if they're not ready. And the dangers of that to sustainable development is immense. So I guess the contribution is raising awareness about this dichotomy and this the lack of consistency of having a weak below the ground foundational infrastructure, and yet you're having this spikes of construction all over in many places, such as Manila. I mean, it wouldn't be it's not virtuous vertical growth in some places, I would say. Personally, whenever I travel to one of the cities that I've been to, all of the 8 that are in this case studies, I always stay typically in a tall building, but I always stay in a low floor, because you know what, the firefighters can't get to floor number 40 in the cities. There are no stairs. I mean, so in fact, above a certain level in those buildings, you're a person of faith when you sleep in those buildings. So I wonder about the verticality and how we view it.
Really, really thoughtful responses by all of you. Thank you. Both of you spoke a little bit about the importance of getting the enabling environment right in order to ensure that some of the strategies that Anjali laid out could actually work in practice. One of the big pieces of the paper is these kind of 3 strategies, but recognizing that for these 3 strategies to work, the enabling environment had to be in place. That is oftentimes easy to say, but very difficult to do. And so I was wondering if each of you could comment a little bit more about how can cities put in place the environment that would enable us to ensure that urban expansion took place in a thoughtful way. And in so doing, I was struck, Victor, by your happy story thing. It reminds me, in my spare time, I'm reading Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, and there's an opening sentence, happy families are all alike, unhappy families are each different in their own way. And this point about can we generalize a little bit, given the heterogeneity of cities in the developing world? So, Karen, I mean, as you think, I mean, you were a co-author of this paper, but would love to just hear a little bit more about, this question regarding the enabling environment and how do we help cities put that in place?
Well, it's very clear from the analysis that the lack of institutions and governance to shape the built environment is one big limiting factor. And I think that is, that's partly about human capacity, capital, it's about training, but it's also about issues around legitimacy and certainly issues of finance as well. I think that it's, I liked your starting off with the Anna Karenina example, because if we look at successful, thriving cities, they are very similar in many ways. They've got institutions, they've got functioning economies. There's clearly a land market which enables them to grow vertically. And they've got, as Victor put it, they've got the stuff underneath the ground, the infrastructure, the basic municipal services that attract capital, both human and financial capital, as well as investments. The struggling cities are those that, like families, the struggling cities are struggling for so many different reasons. I think we would also be remiss if we didn't mention the long historical histories of these different cities. The history of the colonial legacy. Some of these cities are torn by issues of tribalism. And I think we really have to think beyond the financial aspect and think more in terms of the historical context in which these cities are operating.
Yeah, I very much appreciate the mention of history. I think that is central to any study of cities. Two other factors that I think are relevant has been mentioned. One of them is the issue of governance at different levels. That's kind of key for a happy story. And also, I think that not everything can be solved. Not all issues of cities can be solved with policies that target cities. One of the main causes here is informality in labor. That kind of affects, the use of land, affect the access to credit markets, the access to a production of housing that, it's going to prevent the expansion of informal areas, and also productivity levels in general. So some of the issues that we see in cities are the consequences of failures in other areas. And I would, strongly look at the policies that promote better job markets and more formal job markets.
Thank you. Well, I got these questions ahead of time. So, I was thinking about it. I think that, it's an extreme, this is, I think, the most complex problem on earth. Yeah. I don't think there's anything more complicated than this. I think that it's really very important to understand the winners and the losers in reform. Things don't change because there is a dynamics where someone is not willing to give up a position. And until that is clearly understood and diagnosed, and then an intervention can take place to address that situation, we will not be able to, with any data or any planning, solve any problem. So it is, and we have tried to do that in a few places. It's very messy. Your paper hints at some of the complexities in Mumbai, for example. And I think it is one of the greatest challenges that we face. The initial step, the first step of really understanding the problem. On the issue of institutional development and capacities, we need new institutional capacities, and much different than what was used to develop the existing built environment. It just doesn't apply. And there are some examples. I think the innovations of the municipal planning institutes, that have developed in Latin America and in other places, starting, with Curitiba, but morphed into other places like Ciudad Juárez in Mexico. You have committed young planners that are given some latitude to be professional. They're also, they manage data. They're not politically manipulated if the framework is right. I think that's the necessary type of institutional structures that are necessary to take on such a difficult task. If you have, the committed mayor with a planning department that is going to be nice for 3 years, you're not going to be able to make it. You need new institutions, new ways of doing business, and inspired on some successes that have already taken place. I also think you need a kind of an urgency that is beyond anything that could be conceived as a national emergency. It's amazing that we have all these numbers, and yet, we'll go home and we'll have dinner, and then we'll go to work tomorrow, and that's it. I mean, did anything change? It's in some of the cities, every day that you delay an action, it becomes incredibly more complex to solve the problem. And, in some cities that we have been engaged in, we've known about the problems for 20 and 30 years. It's really, I think that the call to urgency is really very important. I also think that you need new tools. The issue of gathering data and generating information. I mean, in many cities, the information is known to a few. and they know back of the envelope the land markets, but you need much more agile mechanisms to generate data in a more transparent way. And I think without those, I think it'll be very difficult to get reform.
Great, Victor, thank you. I'm going to give one more quick question for each of you, then I'm going to give Anjali a minute to just reflect on what she's heard, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So just remarkable paper, but with any paper that you can only cover so much. As you think about, what's either missing or what would you like to see come next in terms of, given what has been done, what's the next question that you feel we collectively need to be asking, thinking about, researching on? And why don't we go in reverse order, just so we'll come back to Karen and then Anjali. So, Victor.
Okay. Well, I mean, to me, within the paper, and going back to the issue of the urgency of what is required to be done, I think that the message that is presented in the paper is very comprehensive, is very reasonable. I think our evaluation will look a lot like that. We already have some drafts of what we would be looking at. I think it's hitting the right issues. I think that one of the things that would worry me is that this idea of incremental change. Incremental does not mean slow. I think you need to say fast incremental change. I mean, if the reform process is not faster than the problem that is being created, we're always going to be behind, and we are way behind. So to me, this idea of presenting an incremental changes is potentially a place where someone that could be seen as wanting to say the right thing, they could hang their hat on that and then do a few things, and then in 5 years nothing would have changed. So I think that there needs to be a bit of a more challenging set of objectives. I think it's really be great to have some good success stories of slum transformation. It would be good to have some good stories of planned growth. I think that would be, inspirational. And then I think that the other issue that we discussed about a year ago is, I think that there needs to be a way to channel investments within a city other than to speculate with land. As long as the best investment is to put your money and wait it out, you're going to be, I think, in a difficult situation. So it's important to have alternatives. I don't know anything about the financial markets, but I know that if you don't have one and you have land, that's where people go. Nora?
Thank you. I think that the notion of time needs to be, or it would be interesting to weave that into all that has been done. One is how you negotiate present versus future needs. Like some of the things that cities are demanded to do are going to be useful for the future, but will demand a lot of sacrifices in the present, and that will create, issues for the population or for the action of implementing these works or sacrifices. The other thing that it's not just in this paper, but in particular, it would be interesting to think about is the notion of synchronicity, in the sense that what happens when a city develops in a context in which other cities have already been developed. The first map, to me, in which you have both what is called the global south and the global north, which doesn't make that much sense to say, but when you have that, and the fact that a city is thriving or is stabilizing, but it's in a country that is undeveloped and is trying to catch up with cities that are in countries that are already developed. So there is a whole dynamics there. And I think that that's something to include in terms of the enabling environment. It's not the same to come after or being London when it was industrializing. There's a challenge. The challenge is different.
Very, very thoughtful. Karen. reflections on what you heard, or your own thoughts on next steps. And I just want to make sure the audio is working. Go ahead. Karen, we're just
Can you still hear me now?
We can hear you now. Yes.
Okay. All right. So I think if the question is, what are the big set of next questions? I think a really big one is around what cities can actually do. It's around questions of agency. I think especially now, whether it's issues of climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, reducing equity, promoting economic development, we're expecting cities to do a heck of a lot. And yet, I think, as Nora said earlier, cities can only really do so much within their administrative boundaries. They're operating within a larger administrative framework, a national framework. We know that a lot of cities now get financing from foreign capital. They get financing from other sources that are not local. And so I think there are big questions about what is the agency that local decision makers have. And it goes beyond a question of what can they do. It's a matter of how can they interact with the private sector and other levels of decision making, whether it's at regional, national scales, to affect change. So, you know, for one example of that is I used to teach at Stanford, and when I taught at Stanford, there seemed to be a endless parade of decision makers from around the world who had come to Stanford, and they wanted to know how could they replicate Silicon Valley. And for many, they thought, okay, the secret sauce, the recipe was you get an institution, you get a university, you get some smart people together, and you get a garage. and that's the formula, you know, and that ignores this longer history and the historical context of national government, the US national government investing in transportation right after World War II. The US government investing in the Cold War military complex in Silicon Valley, right? And those are national investments that bore out locally. And I think this is what we need to have a much better understanding of, is how these decisions across scales play out locally. And very importantly, how can local decision makers then take advantage of these investments across scales?
Very great. Thank you, Karen. I'm going to be very unfair. I'm going to give you a minute. Quick reflections, because I want to get to the audience, but great, you know, pushes around stories, around urgency, around time, around agency. Yep. We're actually doing some research on a couple of these questions, but any quick reflections?
So I absolutely agree with you, that push to figure out who does what in cities. You know, it's really interesting, also going back to the original question you asked, when enabling conditions themselves don't exist or are in such a weak state in these cities, what can you do? What can you do when public officials themselves own a lot of the land and are having private deals with private developers and are corrupt? How do you change that sort of environment, institutional environment? I agree with Victor. You need new institutions, but if I have to think of, you know, what I describe as institutions, you know, the Douglas North version of, you know, incentive structures, you need, and how do you come about with new incentive structures, with policies, with regulations? That is the city's purview and the city's sort of space in which they can play and design these sorts of incentive structures. And that's why I kind of, we allude to that a little bit, but I think the point about aligning the actions of these various actors is very important. I will just say very quickly, it didn't get covered in this paper, but the parallel process that we're doing of the case studies, the one we launched last month in December on Johannesburg, is an amazing story of how the national level, the provincial level, the local level regulations and policies have all been aligned to break down these apartheid era spatial inequalities in the city and draw in private investment. And it's still playing out. It's a story of radical incrementalism, if you will, but over time they've tried to align these policies and direct development in a way that is more spatially equitable. So it's a good story to read. Concrete example. I'll stop there. Looking forward to the audience feedback.
Great, thank you. You guys have been really patient. So let's take some questions. Just ask you, say kind of who you are, and then the question. We'll start right there, please. Oh, we would just ask, just for the Karen and for others that may be online, just press. You may have to press it.
I think I've got a green light, so I'll go ahead. Rick Rybeck with Just Economics. Thanks to the panel and to Karen. Great information, very insightful, and a lot to think about. One of the things I was thinking just at the end here, Victor said, we need success stories, more success stories to motivate change and show us the right way to go. And I'm wondering what the panel might think about the transition that both Japan and Taiwan made after World War II, from being pretty third world countries and becoming first world countries. And one of the things that was talked about in your paper was the importance of land value capture and land taxation. Those were both implemented in Japan and Taiwan after the war. And I'm wondering if that might not be a case of a success story.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take a round, and then I'll come back to the panelists. So yes, please. You have this.
Yeah. Great. So I have a couple of questions for Anjali and for Karen. My name is Tony Beecher from George Washington University. Hi, Karen. Good to see you on the screen. So my first question is the following one. Previous studies have shown that while we're already facing this humongous number of people who are going to urbanize, as we said, in fact, they will be occupying more urban space than their predecessors. Basically that because of urban growth, because of economic growth, ultimately households become smaller in size, require more space, dwellings become bigger, and there is a tendency for sprawl to dominate the way urban growth will unfold and has unfolded. So I was wondering if, in your look at these 499 cities, if you had any evidence of an acceleration of sprawl. That was my first question. My second one was a bit related to what Karen was saying before. Is there any evidence of climatic concerns now affecting urban policies and helping to shape cities away from risk for those that are in potentially risky areas, or is there any evidence of policies that are incorporating a concern to decarbonize or to reduce emissions in terms of how the cities are being shaped up for future growth? Now, clearly, this may be applying to some only of those groups of cities that you're looking at, perhaps those where governance is stronger, capabilities to do land use planning is stronger, so on and so forth. But if anything of that kind has come up in your research. And finally, I come to this, I ask you why 499 and not 500.
Great. See if there's one more question, and then we'll do another round. Ani?
Just a quick, first of all, I think this is truly, I agree with Victor. It's a very, very good paper. I've been following this literature for a while, and I think this is going to be a real contribution in a very significant way. I just wanted to raise two things. One thing that we didn't discuss a lot, and Victor kind of raised it, is we could have easily called this paper demystifying density. This idea of density and what is good density and what's the bad density is a very poorly used across the world, across this space of how cities should grow and be needed. And I think this paper does a very good job talking about density in a way, like the Chinese example, where they're very high density. That necessarily doesn't mean this is great density or very well planned or very high density in slums. So for your first picture, which is actually per hectare, is a much higher density than a lot of places, that also doesn't mean it's great density. This idea of understanding density at a different scale and different places and what is good and what is connected, I think is a very important contribution. We could do much more on that as we go forward. And I want to I don't want to contradict or question, but just to comment on Victor's skyscraper envy, high density does not need to have skyscrapers. You can have very high density in a walkable 3-4 floor. So this is why we need a much better understanding of what density is and how could it be used. The other point I think you guys made in the paper very well is this institutional infrastructure that is needed for this to happen in the future. And it didn't jump out in the presentation, but the institutional infrastructure needed for height seems to be quite different from institutions that are needed for expansion, which is one is a multi-jurisdictional problem, needs multiple different kind of institutions, and one is a very different of infrastructure on the ground, as Victor said, and other things that requires vertical. And differentiating these two would be actually very interesting going forward, and might be a very positive way for us to show what is possible. And I agree with Victor very much. I think the paper tries to show what's already happening in cities, positive examples, because we can't wait till cities become rich and have business institutions in place, right? They need to make things happen. We all have to make things happen now, and that could be a place we could do some more work.
Great, thanks, Ani. So I think counted 6 different questions there, but who would like to? Don't have to answer them all, but if you want to pick 1 or 2 and respond to that, that would be great. Maybe I'll start with Karen, just because it's more difficult to do so remotely, and then I'll come to the 3 of you. Karen, would you like to?
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to say hi to Tony, and it's nice to hear your voice, Tony. And I'll answer a couple of the questions that you posed. So the analysis that we did was over a 10-year period, both in the vertical and horizontal domain. And what we see is this increase in the land, as you mentioned, an increase in land that's necessary for each new urban resident. Do we see, so your question was, do we see an acceleration of sprawl? We don't have enough of time series data to show that, but if we combine our study with other studies, like for example, the study that folks like Solly Angel and others have done, we do see this trend of increasing more land per urban resident. And so this is a continued trend. Your question about decarbonization, I think it's really clear from a number of reports, including the recent IPCC report that you contributed to, that it's essential that cities grow in a way where there's a co-location of employment and residential densities. And this speaks to Ani's question about density. It's not just a matter of increasing density, that in fact we have to think about making places accessible. And I think if there's another big area for research, this is certainly one of them. The data that we have certainly isn't at a fine enough resolution where we can see whether this density, the increase or the change in density means that people are not co-located to where they want to be. I think that's a really big question. But anyway, it's not clear from the data. The very first question that Rick asked about Taiwan and Japan, absolutely, those are success cases, and I'm glad you brought them up. And I think whether you're looking at Tokyo or whether you're looking at Taipei, both of those cities are very, very large cities in terms of population and the built environment. But both of those are designed around neighborhoods, pretty discrete neighborhoods. And you talked about land value capture and other strategies for them that have been deployed in both of those cities. I mean, both of those cities are incredibly walkable, incredibly accessible. I think those are really good examples of case studies. So thank you for bringing those up.
Thank you, Karen. One of you like to?
Well, I have the mic. Let me just say a few things about the first question. And I think I agree with Karen, but I would go to other examples. I mean, that are perhaps more recent and relevant. There are experiences in Bhutan with land readjustment. We have now a pilot in Vietnam. Clearly, it's necessary. But I think that the problem has been, in part, I always have fights with my friends, the urban economists that work on transport, because when you try to justify and you do the benefit cost analysis on a transport study, it's mesmerizing to realize that it's done aspatially. I mean, they do it with a spreadsheet, and land prices don't matter as long as they get the benefits out of the transportation system in time savings and vehicle efficiency because they're not breaking down, and they get a positive return. That project gets a green light. And I have had my my share of fights at the bank because I think that is that way of thinking about infrastructure, about whether or not infrastructure should be put in place without taking into account not, in the most elementary way, just land prices, and clearly who captures the benefit is fundamental to issues of equity. And I think that the whole practice of defining what infrastructure goes in cities is not built around getting the best solution and the best answer with respect to from a development point of view, which is very worrisome. Very worrisome. So I think your question goes even deeper than whether or not there are good examples. There are good examples, but I think the current practice is debilitating to getting a good result on land use.
Just to follow on that thought and some of the questions in the conversation, I think that success needs to be defined. I mean, when we talk about successful stories, it's unclear to me, what success looks like. Of course, going back to Anna Karenina, okay, perfection is perfection, but it's clearly that there are cases in which you achieve success in one measures and not in others. So while we get there, when we talk about examples, which is the aspect that we are highlighting here? Like, for example, the Japanese case, it's wonderful in many aspects, but today in many of the cities they are having issues of not enough children, converting daycare places into places for elders, and there's a whole issue of how sustainable is the city, and you wonder, is this a success story now? So I think that the same can be said about density. When you talk about density, we did a paper in which we were trying to find, okay, what's an ideal density? And the notion of ideal was defined as the less expensive density in terms of supplying the three basic services that the municipality has to supply, which was like water, sanitation, and electricity. And that gives you 9,000 people per whatever square kilometer. But that's success in such a narrow measure, because a city could be more expensive and yet, be a more equitable city or a more productive city. But I think that in order to make, this a conversation about policy, we have to unlock the idea of a successful city into specific measures. Otherwise, it's very, very hard to get there.
Before I give you the mic, I think on the issue of the good and bad density that Annie mentioned, maybe some years ago it was a question that couldn't be answered, and people would say it's too complicated. We move along, we just move on. We know planning, and we have some standards, but that's not, the excuse is not valid anymore about the complexity. There are scenario planning software now being developed. I know that Tony is working with Urban Footprint with Peter Calthorpe, and right now you can start to model the city in a way that in the the 1969 experiment at MIT, if you actually have the original volume of urban dynamics, it's most of my textbooks are trash. They were really wrong. But now with technology and with computing power, you are able to say what can be good and bad density by having a good understanding of what people desire, and from many points of view: health, education, walkability, many factors. So I think that we need to embrace technology now. I think 2019. I think we're ready.
Anjali, just a response to a couple of things. So maybe not Taipei or Tokyo, but we do talk about Seoul, South Korea in the paper. And we trace that example out because it is, briefly, but it is one of those cities that was able to, over 40 years, and we have evidence from 1980s onwards up to now, where the city went from being, again, having a lot of informal growth, high population growth in these 4 decades, but then moving to a better planned city, doing land readjustment, experimenting with it, learning from it, finding that prices go up, but then finding ways to tone that down and make it more affordable. We talk about that as a success example of growth. Talk about some cities like Ahmedabad in India that are being able to sustainably use land readjustment to, for example, direct affordable housing within the city. I wanted to, so the climate concerns is a really interesting question. Right now, we are actually working on a paper on how cities need to adapt to a changing climate. And one of the big questions coming up is, isn't what you would do for climate adaptation pretty much what you would do with respect to much of what I was talking about today? Access to services, not having populations living in vulnerable locations, and so on. It is a convergence of the agenda. So the only comment I wanted to make there is really all of this is a climate agenda as well. And one last thing just on density and accessibility, Karen's point, that it is really not about density. And density is interestingly now by researchers being unpacked into, overcrowding, height of buildings. There's many multiple layers to what density is. So that there's a better understanding. I agree with Victor. But on accessibility, we are, as part of the WRR series, going to be launching in the next couple of months. So stay tuned. The next paper on transportation, which is defined all around equitable access to opportunities. It is a transportation paper, but it tries to look at that co-location that you were talking about, Karen, of co-location of jobs and housing. What is the appropriate scale at which that needs to happen? Can that ever really happen successfully at a neighborhood scale? Is it always a regional problem? So we're kind of trying to look at some of those questions. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Just a couple of those also reminded me of that Keynes quote, the difficulty is not only in developing new ideas, but escaping from old ones. And I think we're kind of both developing the new ideas, but recognizing we need to escape from some of those old ideas as we make this shift and this transformation. What I'd like to do now is I believe we're going to actually have you stay here. And one of my colleagues, Janet Ranganathan, who's the Vice President of Science and Research, I think is going to join us and is going to show a little bit about a demo regarding some of this urban expansion data and a platform that she has helped create called Resource Watch, and to illustrate in a very vivid way what we have been talking about today. So over to you, Janet.
Many thanks, Manish. Actually, I'm not going to demonstrate anything. My colleague Elise will do. In a moment, just share you some of the urban expansion data on Resource Watch. I was just asked to say a few words about Resource Watch. I've heard the word technology and data quite a few times. So Resource Watch, in its sort of essence, is about getting the right data in the right hands at the right time. So decision makers and those who hold those decision makers to account don't always have the data. Despite the fact that there is a growing exponential volume of data, it's still very hard to assess, combine, visualize. Much of it's not open. So addressing that is kind of the heart of Resource Watch. So it's sort of a gateway to data, first of all. Not just any data, but kind of trustworthy data that we created and selected very carefully with standards. So no fake news there. Secondly, it gives the user the ability to personalize data, to look at a specific location, to visualize and combine and contextualize, and then to sort of serve that. Third, it's all free, it's all open. And in fact, the source code underneath is open. So it's kind of like a little Lego box. You can build on it and leverage it for your own needs. And then lastly, it's sort of joined up. So it's integrated data. We have a lot of thematic specific platforms like Global Forest Watch and Aqueduct. Resource Watch is the more joined up version of this. So over to Elise to give the demo.
Hi, I'm Elise Mazer. I'm on the Resource Watch team, and I'm just going to show you around Resource Watch a little bit, but mostly demonstrate the data that you've seen today. So when you land on Resource Watch, this is what you see. You can preview some of our latest blog stories that we pull from insights that we get from the data on the site. We have topic pages that give a brief introduction to each of these topics that we think are major environmental topics. And you can see a variety of ways you can get involved with the data as well as the platform itself. So our main features under data are explore the data sets, where we have our data catalog, Planet Pulse, where we have all of the near real-time data sets, our topic pages, as I just mentioned, and the blog. I'm going to take you into the explore so we can look at the data. You can see on the left side all of our data sets. This is the catalog. And we have this search feature where we have filters. You can filter by any topic. You can filter by data type, frequency, or time period. Since we're here to look at expansion data, I'm going to type in expansion. And you can see the first thing that comes up is urban expansion. So if I click on that, you'll see the data sets that are related to urban expansion. You can see city expansion index, which is what we'll look at today. And you can also see the economic capacity categorization of cities that Anjali was mentioning earlier in the presentation. So I'll add city expansion to the map. I'll close this so you can see more. Just a brief introduction. You have some basic tools over here. One that I want to mention is changing the background map, so you can change it to different things to accommodate different map styles. And also we have a share function, and I encourage you all to use this. This is so you can share this map that you're looking at on social media, embed it on your website, share it wherever you'd like. So let's dive into this data. You can see that the light blue points on this map show a low upward expansion growth, and the dark blue show a high upward expansion growth. So more cities are growing upward and more efficiently, as Anjali was explaining earlier. If you zoom around, you can find which cities are at what levels, and you can click on them to see the upward or the outward expansion values. So in addition to upward, we of course have outward as well. And this one's a little bit more fun to look at. So on this map, you can see the light small circles indicate low outward expansion, and the dark red circles show the more rapidly or the larger outward expansion in cities, whether that's through informal settlements or sprawl. And again, you can click on these and see the index values. So one other feature you can do is if you click on this eye, you get a brief overview of what you're looking at. And if you click on more info, this is the nitty-gritty of the data, the longer explanation of how this data was created. You can see the source. Here it's Yale created this data set. We also have a custom visualization tool where you can create graphs and charts, and you can look at the table that is underlying the data. We also have lots more information about each data set and similar data sets. As Janet likes to say, this is what other products you might be interested in, similar to Amazon, but these are free. So if we go back, I'll open this up in the map again. And I want to focus on the outward expansion today. So one of the best features of Resource Watch is the ability to overlay different data sets. So we have the fortune of being able to show you the underlying data that created this. So I'm going to zoom into Addis here. So we have the change in global human settlement layer, which is how much built up area has changed from 2000 to 2014. And you can see that it seems like roughly the outskirts of the city are the ones that have higher values, so that more change, more growth outward. So I want to go more in detail here. So I'm going to look up population. And we have this really nice high resolution population data set. It's a 250 meter grid. So what you're looking at now, I'm going to hide this, is the 2015 population density. So this is people per square kilometer. If we slide back in time to 1975, you can see Addis was a much smaller city at the time. And we can go over to 1990. You can see it get a little bit larger, 2000 and 2015. I'm going to switch back to 2000 just so you can see this growth a few times. So you can see there's a lot on the outskirts here and on the southwest side as well. So I'm going to bring back that original change in global human settlement layer. And you can see that is exactly where this picked up outward growth. So I want to do more. I want to get more in depth with this, maybe bring in some other contextual data sets. So I'm going to clear this and go through our topics. And I'm going to say, let's look at biodiversity. So in our biodiversity data, we have biodiversity intactness. And if I add this to the map, you can see this means the amount of original species that are still in this area. And they, this entire region has a really high, has high values for biodiversity intactness. It's very dark green, which makes me curious. We also have biodiversity hotspots. And if we lay that, if we put that layer on, we'll see that Addis is in the middle of a hotspot. And a hotspot is an area with high biodiversity and it is threatened. So that should be of concern. So I'm going to zoom back in here with, we'll turn the hotspots off. And we can drag the population data set up to the top. And you can see as the population goes up from 2000, 2015, that the population is encroaching on this high area of biodiversity. Now, Addis is not the only city where this is happening. I'm going to use our little search feature over here to go to Kochi, India. And you can see that we have our population density on the top here. And again, there's this very dark green, high biodiversity intactness surrounding the city. And again, you can see that if you zoom out, there is a massive biodiversity hotspot all along the southern coast, very close to where the population is growing into. And if you go up to 2015, you can see the city is encroaching on that area and it's of concern for that biodiversity hotspot. So I encourage all of you to go find your own insights on Resource Watch, and please use our little share button, share it to social media. If you have any ideas of blogs or find any cool insights that you want to share with the world, please let us know. We also have an amazing API where you can build your own apps on it. So we encourage you to look around and see what you can get.
Wow. That was a kind of fun end, huh? Thank you very much, Janet and the Resource Watch team. This was the best demo I've seen of this. Like maybe because it's on cities. I just want to thank all of you for being here. Thank you, Nora and Victor, for joining us. Really, really interesting topic and interesting conversation. You guys have been doing this work for a while, so it's good to have kind of the community here as we launch this. I want to thank the WR team for putting this together. Very, very impressive work. Karen, I hope you're still connected. But Jillian, Robin, Anjali, of course, who's been leading WRR work now and this paper. I hope you're relieved. And Victoria, I don't know if you're connected. She's online. Thanks to all of you for doing this. I also want to thank, once you flip to the report, you will see it has really cool charts and graphs. And the comms team has done an incredible job actually working, putting this together, because communicating this very complex sets of stories through graphs and charts, and Nora, you mentioned that, is a very impressive task. It allows us to tell the story to a wider audience, which is not just city nerds, but other people, lesser, but other people. But they've done a really, really great job. Tini Sky, I don't know, comms team is here, Talia, but also our graphic designer, Carney and others. They are not here right now, but they've done a very good job. As Karen actually very nicely set up our next paper, which is, I don't think it was planned. It's not only talking about where people live, but how people move around in a city. And these things together make cities work, among other things. And the paper we are going to put together and publish in maybe a couple of months now, Anjali, ask a very important question. Let's say mobility paper, but does not ask the question of what mobility there is city, but how can people get from where they live to where they need to go, whether it's a job, school, hospital, and how can that idea of accessibility help us think through these issues of long-term success of cities. So I hope you join us for that. And we are very much looking forward to it. And a couple of our case studies will be also released in the next couple of months. So busy time ahead for the RWR team. But thank you for being here. And thank you, Manish. I know you have to run, pick up your kids, but thank you very much for moderating it. And I hope, I don't know. Yes, I hope there's some drinks and stuff out there so you can come, we can join us for drinks, and so we can continue this conversation and catch up with each other a little bit. Thank you very much. Congratulations, Anjali.